The train screamed to a halt, metal shrieking against metal, a dying sound that faded into the wide emptiness of the prairie. Steam hissed and curled around the wooden platform of Wickett's Junction, a forgotten stop halfway between nowhere and somewhere people only ever pass through. The sun hung low, spilling long shadows across the cracked planks. When the last whistle echoed off into silence, the only movement left was a young woman clutching a baby to her chest, as though it were the only thing keeping her heart beating. The train conductor gave her a quick glance before stepping back onto the car. He didn't say a word. A moment later, the wheels began to turn again, the train dragging itself down the tracks, shrinking into the distance until it disappeared into the gold and gray horizon. The dust it left behind swirled around her boots, catching in her throat and eyes, but she didn't move. Her body was stiff with disbelief, her arms aching from holding the child too long, too tightly. He had left her just like that. She had begged him not to. He'd told her to wait, said he needed to check on something, said he'd be right back. His voice had been low, coaxing, almost kind. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to. Belief was a habit she hadn't yet learned to break. But when the engine's whistle sounded and the conductor called for boarding, she saw him turn his face away. No look back, no farewell, just a man walking away fast enough to make it clear he'd meant for her to see it. Now she stood alone, the baby stirring against her shoulder, small fists batting at the air. The little one whimpered, a thin, reedy sound that pierced her heart. She rocked him gently, whispering nonsense words she hoped sounded soothing. The wind tugged at her skirt, lifting the hem and cutting cold against her legs. She looked around the station. It was small, a single wooden building with a peeling sign that read, Wickett's Junction, Pop, 212. The paint was so faded it might have been older than she was. A half-dozen men were unloading crates from the freight car, rough-handed ranch workers by the look of them. None met her eyes for long. They knew better than to ask questions. Out here, a woman with no ring and a baby could only mean trouble or tragedy, and both were best avoided. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the night before. She pressed her cheek against the baby's head, smelling the faint milk scent of him, and her eyes stung. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured, even though it wasn't. Even though she didn't know what she would do when the sun went down. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, legs trembling. The baby needed food, a roof, something more than the threadbare shawl wrapped around them both. But there was no one coming for her. No one even knew her here. She didn't have a name to give if they asked. The man who'd left her, he'd taken that too, along with her small suitcase, her papers, and what little pride she had left. For a long while, she just stood there, the train gone, the world around her turning darker by the minute. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the tracks, flat, pale grass trembling in the wind, a sky so wide it felt like it might swallow her whole. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. The sound made her shiver. A board creaked behind her. She turned quickly, her grip tightening around the baby. He stood near the post at the end of the platform watching her. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, his long coat dusted from the road, a hat pulled low enough to hide most of his face. His silence was heavy but not unfriendly, the kind of silence that said he didn't waste words. His eyes, when the light caught them, were a stormy gray, watchful and calm all at once. "Train leave you behind?" he asked, his voice deep and slow, like thunder rolling across the plains. She swallowed hard. "No," she said, her voice thin. He did. The man's jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hat. "That so?" She nodded, shame burning her cheeks. "Said he'd come back." "Men who say that don't usually do," he replied after a moment. His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. Her lips trembled. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words hung there, fragile, like glass. The man didn't move. The wind caught his coat, flaring it slightly, but he stood rooted, looking at her, at the baby in her arms, at the hopelessness etched into her face. Then he took one slow step forward. "You got kin anywhere?" "No," she whispered. "No one." He studied her for a while longer, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather flask. He held it out to her without a word. She hesitated, her instincts warning her not to trust strangers, but thirst won. She took it, her fingers brushing his as she did. His hands were calloused and warm, steady as the earth itself. The water inside was cold, metallic, but it felt like the kindest thing she'd ever tasted. She handed it back, eyes downcast. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once, slipping the flask back into his coat. "Where are you headed?" "I don't know." "Then you're already there," he said quietly. Something about the way he said it made her chest ache. The baby began to fuss again, small cries rising and falling in the empty air. She bounced him gently, whispering, "Hush now, little one, hush." But the exhaustion caught up to her. Her knees wobbled, her head swam. The man's eyes softened just a fraction. He stepped closer, boots scuffing against the boards. "You can't stay out here. Nights get cold quick. I'll figure something out." He shook his head slowly. "Ain't nothing to figure." He turned toward the edge of the platform where a horse stood tied to the post. Tall, chestnut-colored, patient as its owner. The man adjusted the reins, then looked back at her. "I got a place about 3 miles west. Cabin's small, but it's warm. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." Her heart hammered. "Why would you help me?" He met her gaze, gray eyes steady, unreadable. "'Cause someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." She blinked, not knowing what to say. "Don't got to if you don't want to," he added, voice calm. "But the wind's turning. You'll freeze before midnight if you stay." She looked down at the baby, the tiny face nestled against her shoulder, the frail chest rising and falling. The idea of walking into the unknown scared her, but the idea of standing here, waiting for no one, terrified her more. Slowly, she nodded. "All right." The man tipped his hat, the faintest trace of something like approval flickering across his face. "Name's Cole," he said. She hesitated, opening her mouth to reply, but the truth caught in her throat. She didn't have a name anymore. The one she'd been born with didn't feel like hers after what she'd endured. It had been spoken too many times by someone who didn't mean it. When she didn't answer, Cole didn't press. He just offered a hand. For a long, trembling moment, she stared at it, rough, strong, steady. Then she shifted the baby to one arm and placed her hand in his. It was the first warmth she'd felt in days. And as the last light of the sun bled out across the prairie, she followed the silent cowboy away from the empty train station, leaving behind the life that had abandoned her. The cabin was small, crouched at the edge of a cottonwood grove where the prairie wind softened into whispers. Smoke rose from the crooked chimney, carrying the faint smell of wood and stew, and when the woman stepped inside, she felt the warmth hit her like a tide. After the endless cold of the station platform, it was almost too much. She stood just inside the doorway, the baby bundled close, unsure if she had the right to breathe the air of a place that felt so still, so safe. Cole shut the door behind them with a quiet click. The wind howled once outside, then faded, trapped behind the walls. He didn't say anything at first, just hung his coat on a nail by the door, the motion slow, deliberate. Everything he did seemed measured, like a man who'd learned long ago that silence said more than speech. "Sit by the fire," he said at last, his deep voice low and even. She hesitated, eyes darting around the small room. The walls were built of weathered pine, a single table with 2 chairs stood near the hearth, and a rough-hewn bed was pushed into the far corner. The firelight flickered across the wooden floor, painting everything in gold and amber. A worn saddle rested against the wall, next to a rifle and a pair of spurs. She moved slowly, her knees weak, and lowered herself into the chair nearest the fire. The baby stirred but didn't cry, his small breaths brushing against her collarbone. The heat from the flames seeped through her shawl, melting the numbness from her fingers. For the first time in days, her body stopped shaking. Cole ladled stew from the pot that simmered on the stove. The smell, thick and rich with meat and potatoes, made her stomach twist with hunger. He handed her a tin bowl without looking directly at her, as though giving her space to pretend she wasn't desperate. She murmured a soft "thank you," then ate slowly, afraid of seeming greedy. The warmth filled her mouth, then spread through her chest, chasing away the ache that had lived there too long. After a while, he sat down across from her, his own bowl untouched for a moment. "Name's Cole," he said quietly. "Cole Thatcher." She glanced up, startled by the sound of his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Thatcher." He gave a faint shake of his head. "Just coal'll do." The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. The sound filled the silence between them. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of the bowl. "I should thank you properly," she said softly, "for bringing us here. I don't know what I'd have done otherwise." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Wasn't right leaving you out there." Still, the way he said it made her throat tighten. Not right. Not pity, not charity, just a plain truth. They ate in silence again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the faint creak of the rocking chair as she soothed the baby back to sleep. After a while, Cole stood and poured a little hot water into a basin, setting it beside her. "You can wash up some if you want. There's clean cloth by the shelf." She nodded, unable to speak. No man had ever shown her simple kindness without wanting something in return. Her eyes stung, and she looked away quickly. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You must think me foolish, trusting someone like him, believing his words." Cole didn't look at her right away. He crouched by the fire, adjusting a log, his face lit by the orange glow. "Ain't foolish to hope," he said quietly. "Only foolish thing is thinking you don't deserve better after it breaks." She watched him, unsure what to say. He wasn't the kind of man who used fancy words or spoke to fill space. Every syllable felt carved from something solid and old. "I don't even have a name anymore," she said suddenly, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "Not one that feels like mine." When he left, it felt like he took that with him too. Cole turned to look at her then, his gray eyes catching the light. "Names don't belong to the folks who hurt us." She held his gaze for a long moment before looking away, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Maybe not. But when you've been called by the wrong one long enough, it's hard to remember who you were before." He nodded once as if he understood more than he let on. "Then maybe it's time for a new one." She gave a small, sad smile. "You can't just make yourself a new name." "You can," he said simply. "You're still here. That's what matters." The simplicity of his answer stole her breath. He reached into his coat pocket, the leather creaking softly, and pulled out a small silver locket. It was tarnished, but beautiful, the kind of thing that carried memory. He turned it over in his fingers once before setting it on the table between them. "Belonged to my ma," he said. "Been holding on to it for a long time. She'd want it to belong to someone who's got a reason to keep going." Her hands hovered over it, uncertain. "I can't take this. It's yours." He met her eyes, steady and sure. "Can't be mine if I got no one to give it to." Something in his tone made her chest ache. Slowly, she reached out and picked it up. It was warm from his touch, smooth against her skin. She clicked it open, and inside was a faded photograph of a woman smiling in front of a field of wildflowers. The edges were worn thin from years of being opened and closed. "She was beautiful," she murmured. "She was," he said softly. "Tough, too. Called me her second chance after my pa passed." She traced the image with her thumb. "What's her name?" "Grace," he said after a pause. Her head lifted. The words seemed to echo through the room, filling it with something gentle and strange. "You look like a Grace to me," he added quietly. The words hung between them, tender and heavy all at once. She felt her throat close, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Grace," she whispered, testing it on her tongue. It felt fragile, new, but right. It didn't taste like shame or loss. It tasted like a beginning. She closed the locket, pressing it to her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. Cole looked away toward the fire, the light glinting off the edge of his jaw. "Don't thank me. Just wear it proud." The baby stirred then, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. Grace rocked him gently, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since the train left, the world didn't feel like it was crumbling beneath her feet. Cole stood and went to the door, glancing out into the darkness. "Storm's coming in," he said. "You'll stay here till it passes." She nodded, the words catching in her throat. He turned back, his expression calm but kind. There's a cot in the corner. I'll take the chair. I can't take your bed, she protested. He just shrugged. You got a baby. You need the rest more. There was no arguing with him, not because he was forceful, but because his quiet steadiness left no room for doubt. She rose from the chair, her limbs heavy but warm, and crossed the room. The cot was small, but when she laid the baby down, his tiny hand curled around her finger. The firelight flickered across Cole's face as he settled into the chair. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the shutters. Inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft breaths of a child dreaming. Grace watched Cole for a long moment, wondering what stories lay hidden behind that silence. He was a man who carried loss like a scar, but he carried it quietly, without bitterness. When she finally lay down, she whispered the name again, as if anchoring it inside her. Grace. Cole's voice came low from across the room, almost a murmur. You do now. And in the warmth of the fire, with the baby safe and the wind singing against the walls, she felt something she hadn't known in a long time. Peace. For the first time in forever, she belonged somewhere.